Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Scott Osborne. How are you?
Excellent. How are you today?
Good. Another day, another podcast.
Another day, another podcast. And I should tell you, I have 3 dogs in my little office here. So if we have any unstrange noises, you'll know what they are.
Hey, I think dogs, cats right now, like that, I find in my happy place when I find myself scrolling. Those are the things that make me happy and give me peace.
This is true. This is true. So today we're going to do some fun stuff. But last week we did pronatalism. Last episode we did pronatalism. And after we hung up, we said, ooh, I bet we're going to need a take 2 because then we found additional material and new things came up. So just a word to the wise, we'll probably have a take 2 on pronatalism at some point here coming up.
I know, which I think will be interesting. It was a great conversation, and I've continued thinking about it, and I've continued to talk to people about it just to see if they were even aware of that it was an issue being discussed. And so it was kind of a 50-50. Some absolutely, and others were like, what? So I think, again, the importance of talking about things. And speaking of talking about things, one good thing, I think, a little bit of a good thing, we've been talking about childcare and the impact on childcare, and we had Brittany Lamont a couple of episodes ago talking about the economic impact of childcare and some of the things our Florida legislators were working on. And in this session, there was a bill passed, House Bill 1255, that
Florida
really
House.
is. Go ahead. Sorry.
Florida House.
Florida House. Yes. Yes, State House, that is focused on preserving childcare access. And really the big switch when we talk about qualifying incomes for a lot of programs, oftentimes they're based on federal poverty level. The federal poverty level has not been adjusted since the 60s. So not that things have changed since then, but maybe a little bit. And this changes it to base it on state median income versus federal poverty, which really increases access. The numbers they don't have exact yet, but they're guesstimating between 30 and 40,000 families will now have access that didn't before. So
great.
There's a positive.
And it's not a budgeting or financial issue to get that access, I gather.
No.
Okay, wonderful.
No. Yeah.
And more childcare is better given what we need. It's such a gap, so that's great.
More childcare absolutely is. And so that's a little headway, and it kind of leads us into there's some good news and what's some interesting things happening.
Scott? Well, let's talk about the SAVE Act. This SAVE, because this one has been percolating, and this one is fascinating. It's gotten a lot of news. I should say, first of all, the SAVE Act is not yet passed. It is not yet law, but we will see where it stands. It passed the House, closely passed the House. This is U.S., is moving to the Senate. I should say this is the second time it's come up. It came up last year. It did not get through the Senate. It's called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And this would require a different set of documents for people to register to vote. As of today, you have to be a U.S. citizen to vote. There's no question about that. That's already federal law. People use a variety of documents to show that. There's no indication there are many problems, but it is now proposed that under this SAVE Act, a voter to register would have to have either a U.S. passport, a birth certificate, or a military ID, basically. Even your so-called real ID, because most of them don't show citizenship, would not be enough. Your driver's license, in other words, wouldn't be enough. So passport, birth certificate, military ID would be required to register to vote. If you haven't thought about registration to vote much lately, this would bring about huge changes. And you can just imagine. I don't know, when was the last time you registered to vote and thought much about it, Ashley?
It's been a minute. And and as women, it is a big issue with name changes, etc.
The most likely block that's easily identifiable. Obviously, there will be people, most people don't have passports. Let me put it that way first. About half of Americans do not have a passport, and it's very expensive and time consuming to get a passport. So the notion of acquiring a passport, if you're not planning on traveling, just to register to vote is not realistic for the vast majority of people. And many people might be able to put their hands on their birth certificate, but if you are one of the vast majority of women in an opposite sex marriage, you probably took the name of your husband, and your birth certificate no longer matches what might be your driver's license, and you will therefore not be able to register to vote. So, one of the biggest identifiable groups are all the women in opposite sex marriage who've changed their names. So, again, there will be people who can't find their documents. It certainly disproportionately affects people who've moved around a lot. Maybe their parents had their birth certificate. How do you access these things? So many citizens will struggle to register. And so we know that. But we certainly know this identifiable group of women who can't possibly show documentation. It's up to the states now. This would, if this law passed, it would give it to the states to say how to solve that. Some of them have proposed saying, well, if you brought in your marriage certificate,
Mm-hmm.
that would show. Again, I don't know. I think you're married, right, Ashley? Could
I
you lay
am.
on your marriage certificate pretty quickly? I suspect many people, you might be organized. Many people probably could not.
Well, but and you and I talked about this. I didn't change my name
Hmm.
because I got married at a more mature age and had built my career. And quite honestly, it just seemed like a pain to change my name. And it didn't bother my husband. And so I'm now happy because I think of there are people having these conversations of, oh my gosh, because
Marriage
you
certificate.
it's the same kind of like what's your blood type? You think of those things, your birth certificate, your blood type, you're like, I know I have a blood type, but what is it? The same with I think all of these documents, and I think we have to talk about socioeconomic impact of the
Mhm.
people that might be moving more often, might have more transient lifestyles, are going to be impacted more. And those are people typically struggling with economic security, living in poverty, the rural areas. When we look at the voting block, it's really more red states than blue states.
It is interesting that it appears that it would affect, just going based upon a couple circumstances, it appears it would affect quote unquote red states and blue states. I hate to generalize them too much, but if we look at how they voted, and that's because it seems like women who are more highly educated, more likely to be left leaning, are less likely to change their names. In other words, more conservative women and women with lower education are more likely to change their names. But again, let me say 80 to 85% of all women take their husband's name. So this is not like it aligns
Right.
with your voting. This is the vast majority of women, and certainly older women were much more likely. It's only really in the last, 20, 30 years we've seen a shift. So really, it's very safe to say that the vast majority of women in opposite sex marriages have taken their name. We also know that some women might have been married and then married again. Maybe they took the name of one
Mm-hmm.
husband but not the other. I mean, there's all sorts of issues. You're absolutely right on the socioeconomic. Anybody who's been in the foster care system, you sometimes have victims who've been in the domestic violence, some sort of protection. They may have changed their name to stay safe.
Mm-hmm.
There's many situations where people are not going to find it easy, and they are perfectly legitimate voters. They may have a driver's license, they may have no
Mm-hmm.
problem with citizenship. We are not talking about people who are not eligible to vote. We're talking about people who are eligible to vote because they are citizens, but now just don't have this documentation. So those are the people that I worry about. I think the whole women taking husbands' names is kind of an interesting thing too, while we're on that. You said you didn't take your husband's name, and women since the ninth, 10th century have been doing it. And it does originate from a concept of property in European and then in English law that women's property, they would merge with their husband. Their husband had legal rights over them and rights to vote if any voting took place. For them, women didn't lost all of their legal rights and often all of their property rights. And
Mhm.
putting their name with their husband was part of that process of making it property. I realize that women certainly have more independent rights today, but that is the origin of why women take their husbands' names in England and much of Europe.
And right, we always forget we have to go back to how socialization, how access to all of those things, it's woven throughout. And it's not just the birth certificate piece, it's the passport. On looking at some of the statistics of people who have a passport, I think it was 1 in 4 people with high school diploma or less have a passport, and it was at 1 in 5. I think that was an income of $50,000 or below have a passport. So, I think that sometimes we've talked about this too, perspective. Perspective is such a beautiful thing. And it's easy to assume if you're a person that travels, that has a passport, that why would everybody would have a passport? What's the big deal? Well, it's expensive. Again, all the documents you have to get a passport. So it's so easy to make assumptions on what's easy for people and then to make people feel less than if they can't. And I just don't like that.
Right. You're a failure. You didn't do it right. You couldn't
Mhm.
figure it out. Yeah, no, that's a good point. It doesn't help people. But I mean, I just want to stress there's estimated to be about 69 million women who do not have a driver's license that matches their birth certificate. And again, the act provides no way out of that. It's assumed, I don't know why, but it's assumed that the states would come up with something. But again, that would then be up to individual states. This also would be a bureaucratic pain. I mean, much voter registration takes place now, and again, it's up to states, but some of it's online, some of it is at voter registration drive. Some people do it automatically when they get their driver's license. States have all different pretty simple procedures to show the appropriate identification and then register to vote. So it would really eliminate many of those. It would really require a whole different bureaucracy. But why we want to disenfranchise this chunk of potentially millions of women and burden them with this is a mystery to me. Why do you think women change? Oh, yeah, I'm going to ask you about why women change their names, but
Okay, go ahead. No, let's do that. So let's talk
yeah,
about
so what? So what? I mean, we know. I was married. I no longer am, but at the time, I didn't change my names. I've always had the same name. So and it seemed when I was younger, it seemed like that was the way everything was going. Of course, women would not change their names. It just felt right. You kept your name. Why do they still change their name, do you think? I mean, this is very common across all ages. I have adult daughters, their friends get married, they change their name. It's just, it is still the norm.
Oh, I think that this is a complex answer. I I think that there in this note, my opinion. So
Okay,
we'll,
your opinion. We won't hold you to any facts on this. This is just
correct. So no, I'm just giving my opinion. I think that there's a lot of societal pressure on being married is equated with stability, success. Like you've achieved. If you get there's that underlying message still, I think. And I think I shared this story with you, and it's just a fun story to share. I mentioned I got married later. I have 2 older brothers. I was a very independent person. And I often joked with my parents, they raised me to be very independent and then didn't know what to do with me when I became very independent. So the fact that I didn't get married till I think it was 42 when I got married. And it was kind of like, oh my God, finally she got married. And I didn't take my husband's name, but my dad always used my husband's name when sending us any, like my birthday cards would always come to.
You used his name for you.
For
I
yeah,
like you to know your name.
he used, and this is my father. Well, it wasn't his parents that, my husband's, my in-laws were not concerned about that. But even at his memorial, which was lovely, etc., I was doing a reading and I laughed when I looked in the bulletin and I was Ashley Brown Templeton, and it just brought a smile to my face. And so I think that there's societal, when we talk about behaviors and socialization and all of that, it makes people comfortable because it's the norm.
Yeah.
I think there's still so much with that, Scott. I don't know. That's my opinion.
I think that's true. I think, you'll often see younger women, especially very independent younger women who are educated, may have their own jobs, may have their own homes when they choose to get married. But then the traditions that we still held on to for marriage are very gender normed. I mean, we don't yet have a new set. Again, there's exceptions, of course, but for most people, we don't yet have a new set to provide some somewhat more egalitarian, which seemed to me to reflect the lives of the individuals. I mean,
Mhm.
we still need bridesmaids and that sort of thing. So some of these traditions, they're certainly also played up in the consumer culture.
Oh,
the
yeah.
this is a big business. But changing their name, I also think, women are still very much socialized, especially in the personal sector, to be acceptable to others, to not rock the boat, to say what they think others want them to hear and to be what they think others want them to be. Even women who seem somewhat independent or very independent professionally, you will still often see that is still very much something that is in our cultural socialization, that you don't want to do something like that. When I looked at some of the surveys about women changing their names, many of them would say, well, my husband likes it or something like that. My husband prefers it. So they didn't say they wanted to. Some might
Mhm.
have, but many of them were clearly already deferring to something that to some of us seemed surprising, you could say. But it's there in any event, and these women may be disenfranchised.
Well, and it's interesting now when you said that. I remember having a conversation with Jim about it before we got married to say, is it important to you? Does it matter to you? And he was very much, and he has stayed that way, like it does not make a bit of difference. And so, but even the fact that I felt I needed to have that conversation on, but I guess that's normal. I don't know. Sometimes I forget that compromise and conversation are part of healthy relationships. Why?
At least acknowledge it is a norm out there, and what are we going to do about it?
Right. Yeah.
That's But I should say the number of men who take their wives' names or couples who hyphenate is still very small. So for families who say we all want to have the same name, it always goes, virtually always goes to the husband's name and not the other way around. And with one exception, of course, is Hispanic families. That is culturally not the tradition. So that is kind of interesting. It depends somewhat on your ethnic origin, where you're coming from, what your cultural tradition is with names.
And that's to take the mother's name. Yes.
Yeah, I think you put in the two surnames. I don't know,
Yes.
but I think you put in the surnames.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think before we sum up here, I think it is important to note that there really is no credible indication that this is fixing a problem. It feels like a solution in search of a problem in terms of voter integrity. There's virtually no evidence that in any measurable numbers non-citizens are voting. So that's also some of the objections people may read about to the bill. I looked up one statistic that said in Michigan, which of course is often a flip state, it's a swing state, so people watch
Mm-hmm.
it closely. And in the 2024 election, there were 5.7 million people who vote. So almost 6 million people who vote. And of that, 15 were flagged as potentially an issue. So that's 0.0002%.
Yeah.
And
I'm
this is
like, how many zeros before the right?
And again, I mean, people who follow election law say most of them are mistakes. They aren't genuinely an individual thinking, I can vote even though I'm not a citizen.
Mhm.
Many of them were genuinely mistakes. People in a different jurisdiction where they thought they'd change their registration, something like that. But I think the point is there's really very little credible evidence that shows there's a problem that we need this law for.
I think that it's really problematic how often the fear and use of the term fraud is presented as a reason to put together really punitive bills or legislation or policy. So this is what I think this is a great example of. Like, what are we trying to, no pun intended, save from this? And the reality is there's no evidence of huge numbers of non-US citizens voting. And I'm going to use another Florida example. In this legislative session, there was a citizen initiative bill that passed that currently, and we talked about this in a past episode, but previously, we'll say previously, Florida had a really restrictive citizen led initiative regulations that you had to have 60% of the voters vote on something for a citizen led initiative to become a constitutional amendment. And that has now been changed to 70% and $1 million bond in order to get any ballot initiative on the ballot because of we're solving fraud. And it's like, what fraud in terms of citizen-led ballot initiatives are on there? And it's, again, we're sending the election police and the to people's homes. Did you sign this petition? And I am all for safety and security of elections and due process and all of that. But I think the narrative that this widespread fraudulent behavior is occurring is just such smoke and mirrors to pass some of these things and make people fearful of it. I just needed to say that because it's bothersome to me.
And it shows distrust in institutions. That's the
Mhm.
underlying issue. And I think that's harmful for everyone. When people don't believe more and more institutions have integrity, do what they're supposed to, that you can trust the officials, then
Mhm.
that jeopardizes people are afraid, they are fearful. And with time, that's a very dangerous thing in a society. And we've seen that progressively, not just in the last few years, but institution after institution that at one time was really trusted and seen as an authority, slowly that fades away. And I personally think that's a very dangerous thing. I think people can accept that there are gray areas, that of course occasionally there will be some fraud or some corrupt
Mhm.
officials, but that we can accept that institutions basically do what they are supposed to in good faith, honestly. That we trust our electoral system, for example. And I think a lot of that is to sow distrust in the institutions as an underlying issue, which is dangerous for all of us. Maybe that's a future podcast.
I feel like that is a future subject, and that's conversation that I've had with friends and family members that pushing back on different narratives. And of course, we can look back and find fault in lots of things because they're people and people aren't perfect and mistakes are made and mistakes in judgment, mistakes in policies, but you have to have the grace for that's going to occur and we adjust and we fix. But if you fully believe that the institutions are here to be detrimental or to be, I don't even know the word I want to put in there.
Well,
That's
predatory. If you
predatory.
believe that they're all predatory, then it's
That's a good
really a
word.
dangerous place and you can't trust anything. And I think that's dangerous from a human perspective for us to walk around feeling that way all the time.
Well, aren't we built to have some trust with each other. I mean, trust is an important part of, I think, our functioning society. So, oh my God, that could be two podcasts, Scott. It could be a one and two. So,
But all right, so taking away from this one, watch the SAVE Act. It does go to the Senate. Again, last year it did not make it through. It may not again, but definitely keep your eye on it this time. So the SAVE Act is moving ahead. Next episode, we're going to bring back Elizabeth Spahn to talk to us again about how conception happens. This is going to be another fascinating topic, and really why the misunderstandings that have worked their way through history infuse all of us, including our elected officials, our scientists today, and what that means about all of the issues around reproductive health and women's legal status. So that'll be a good one.
well, it will be a good one. And she is so interesting to talk to and listen to. So I look forward to that. We talked about a lot of stuff today and data and a House bill in the state of Florida. If you're interested in more info, you can find links to get more information. So be sure to check that out. And as always, interesting conversation, and I appreciate our time together.
Thank you, Ashley. I do as well. See you soon.
See you soon.